the time a family climbed into their covered wagon for the night in 1847, the prairie was as quiet as an old cat warming itself by a stove. The stars blinked above like they'd seen it all before and had frankly grown a bit tired of the drama. Below them, a family of 6, or 10, or 12, depending on nothing but optimism and cornbread, were wrapping themselves in every scrap of fabric they hadn't already turned into mittens or curtains. Winters on the trail weren't just cold. They were the kind of cold that could bite through wool like a hungry raccoon. Snow would sometimes sneak inside the wagon through the canvas cover, and frost might form on your eyelashes if you dared open your eyes past dinner. But bedtime wasn't optional. When the sun dipped below the ridge and the stew pot was scraped clean, it was time to pile into the covered wagon. Not because it was warm, but because it was slightly less freezing than the ground outside. Inside the wagon, privacy was a concept held in about the same regard as indoor plumbing, a delicious fantasy. Families squeezed in shoulder to knee, brothers next to sisters, grandma wedged between a salt barrel and a footlocker. If there was a baby, it might sleep in a drawer. If there wasn't a drawer, someone handier would build one out of wooden spoons and sheer will. Now, let's talk about bedding. Not bedding in the embroidered Egyptian cotton sense, but more in the 1800s. This horse blanket smells like biscuits and mildew way. If you were lucky, your family brought quilts from home. If you weren't, you layered shirts, coats, an old petticoat, and the dog, assuming he wasn't outside chasing phantom coyotes. Pillows, too, were open to interpretation. Some folks brought feather pillows, while others used sacks stuffed with grass, or folded jackets that didn't quite yield to the idea of softness. There are even accounts of people using bags of beans as pillows, because nothing says luxury like snuggling your temple onto a slightly lumpy chili ingredient. By modern standards, these nights would seem unbearable. But back then, folks went to bed early, not out of some virtuous commitment to circadian rhythms, but because the darkness was absolute and candles were precious. Imagine it, bellies full of soggy cornbread and bacon grease, fingers numb from washing dishes in a tin pan with coal creek water. The only sounds, the creaking of the wagon's timber joints, the wind scraping over chilly grass, and the occasional snore that suggested someone was content, or possibly choking on their own mustache. Children were generally the warmest humans on board, which is why adults often flanked them like crusty bookends. Parents took shifts stoking a tiny enclosed stove if the wagon carried one, which few actually did, using leftover embers or, more often, flint and frozen dignity. Otherwise, heat came from humanity. Warm bodies, packed like old library books, dense with stories, and dust. In mornings, breath would hang in the air like ghosts of sentences unspoken. Anyone older than 10 would emerge with stiff limbs and a dull ache in their joints, muttering about bones weather as if they were 80, even if they were 27. And yet, despite the stiff spines, the threadbare blankets, and the distinct lack of peppermint-scented massage candles, this was home. Every night spent beneath that board canvas was one step further west, 1 mile closer to a promise. However distant it seemed in the dark, they told themselves stories, sometimes true, often improved upon. A cousin once fought off a bear with a coffee pot. Mrs. Hennigan saw ghost lights on the plains near Chimney Rock. Children whispered legends of buffalo taller than barns and grandfathers who could predict snow by the way their knees creaked. Though given the ambient cold, almost everyone's knees made an opinion known. And so, they slept, or tried to. They were cowboys and blacksmiths and farmers and women armed with sewing kits and an astonishing tolerance for wind chill. And though history often focuses on what they did by daylight, it's here, in the cold nights, with the infants gurgling and the beans quietly trying not to be pillows, where the human side of history lies, shivering and half asleep. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Close your eyes now. Imagine the stars peeking through a threadbare flap and a prairie wind humming lullabies across the Wagon tongue. The prairie, wide and unhurried, stretches beneath the moon like a patchwork quilt stitched from browns, greys, and old promises. Frozen grasses sway in the ghost of a breeze. It's February, probably, possibly January, the kind of winter month where snow barely falls, just enough to dust things, cryptically, like a note left in poor handwriting. It's quiet and cold, the kind of cold where wood groans louder than people. Inside the covered wagon, the night is alive in subtler, more cramped ways. This particular wagon, the Shumway family's give or take an in-law or two, smells faintly of cured bacon, tired wool, and that dusty flannel optimism peculiar to people crossing the American plains in 1847. Everything is arranged with the kind of chaotic precision only frontier survival could invent. Barrels of flour double as nightstands. Tins of lard quietly hope no one mistakes them for pillows again. And twine is holding things together that twine frankly has no business being responsible for. Under a stack of scratchy quilts, cut from every shirt Uncle Ebenezer ever outgrew, 3 children, 1 baby, and an unbothered cat are all trying to sleep. Next to them, Ma Shumway lies stiff as a board, rigid from both the cold and her deep-seated fear that someone will open the pickles during the night. Pickles, of course, are valuable. On this trail, pickles are like currency, but more hydrating. Now, sleeping in this wagon isn't as simple as we might imagine. First of all, the illusion of coziness is mostly achieved through sheer exhaustion. You don't really snuggle so much as collapse in negotiations with gravity. Mattresses are featherless affairs made of straw and faded homespun, often shared by entire litters of humans. Once you lie down, you must prepare for leg entanglements of epic proportions. Nobody tells you this, but toes in the 1800s were more assertive. The canvas overhead, a once proud wagon cover, is now stiff with frost, turning every little exhale into a puff of silence, every drip of condensation into a menace. It flutters distantly when the wind moves just right, or wrong, usually wrong. Underneath, Pa Shumway fumbles with his infamous nightly invention, a hollowed-out potato stuffed with embers and wrapped in a flannel sleeve. His wagon warmer, he proudly calls it, though no one's sure if it actually helps or just makes everyone crave stew. Tonight, he's tucked it at the foot of the bed pile, which, by frontier law, instantly becomes the cat's bed. "What's the point, Seth?" Ma whispers from somewhere between 2 layers of quilt and sacrifice. Pa says nothing. He's already drifted back into a sort of horizontal consciousness where dreams and weather blur, where you're not sure if the wind is howling outside or if it's just Aunt Mildred breathing through her one working nostril. Out on the prairie, wolves sing a lullaby from 47 miles away, as measured by instinct and inherited fear. Coyotes yip in what one hopes is a respectful tone. And through it all, stars hang fat and low, indifferent to tents, wagons, or human dignity. The fire, long since banked, flickers dimly outside, beneath the iron cooking pot, now home to 3 hopeful mice and possibly the ladle. Inside, sleep comes as it often does on the frontier, gradually, itchily, and with the persistent ticking of your own heartbeat in your ear. People dreamed slower back then, you know. Not out of nostalgia, but because tallow candles didn't lend themselves to midnight introspection. Besides, by the time you spent all day not dying, you weren't exactly up for existential wanderings. The wagon creaks occasionally. An old wheel settles deeper into a rut of frozen soil. Somewhere a cow sighs in its sleep, unaware that it too will be involved in breakfast. And from a distant corner of the wagon, perhaps from somewhere behind the pickles, comes a whisper. The soup will freeze again. This isn't a warning or even information. It's just the kind of statement families make when winter nights are long and the soup has frozen previously. Ma doesn't reply. She knows it will. She's accepted it as one accepts most things in a covered wagon, with a shrug and another blanket. Soon, dreams gather of warm porches, hot biscuits, and places where apples grow in something other than cold, haunted baskets. And as the snow silently thickens outside, wrapping trees and trails in white forgetfulness, the world slows just enough for tomorrow to begin its quiet walk toward dawn. If you've never tried drifting to sleep in a moving wooden box floating across a frozen prairie with zero insulation and an unspoken agreement not to mention your uncle's snoring, then congratulations. You've already got one up on the average 1800s pioneer. The covered wagon, that rolling rectangle of compromise and questionable suspension, was never actually meant for overnight comfort. During warmer months, it had all the cozy intimacy of a small garden shed lined with burlap. But once winter crept in, with its blanketing silences and howling darkness, the wagon transformed into something more, shall we say, aspirational than habitable. Let's begin with the materials, science of the situation. You've got a base of sturdy oak or hickory planks, dependable, splintery, and, inconveniently, excellent conductors of cold. The typical wagon was arched with bent wooden ribs and covered in canvas. Cotton duck fabric waterproofed with linseed oil or beeswax, because nothing says fire hazard like sleeping under an oiled tarp next to a lantern. Still, it kept most of the snow out and only some of the wind. But while the frontier spirit was strong, frontier insulation was not. During a frontier winter, temperatures often dipped well below freezing, and the wagons had about the thermal integrity of a lace curtain in a meat locker. If you've ever exhaled into a wool mitten and felt a moment of steamy triumph before the cold returned, you'll understand the overnight dynamic at play. Rather than heaters or electric blankets, which wouldn't be invented for another several decades, and certainly not for anyone with a horse-drawn lifestyle, the remedy lay in layering, and not the stylish kind. Imagine wearing literally all your clothes at once. Imagine doing that without elastic, zippers, or fleece, and now add some body odor for extra realism. People piled on flannel underdrawers, heavy woolens, hand-knitted scarves of dubious symmetry, and if they were truly lucky, a buffalo robe or bearskin. Your great-great-great-grandma, bless her pioneer heart, went to bed every night looking like a very determined pile of laundry with ideas. Sleeping arrangements inside the wagon were, as the youth say, tight. A family of 6 would squeeze into a space smaller than your average modern minivan. The parents might sleep on a thin mattress or straw tick, laid atop stored supplies, while the younger ones were tucked between crates of flour, barrels of beans, and the occasional cranky chicken. There was a complex choreography to bedtime, Everyone had to climb in, arrange themselves just so, and then absolutely no one could move, lest they start a snore duel, knock over the bacon grease can, or jostle the wagon just enough to let a draft rush in like a rude ghost. Oh, and bathroom breaks. Hope you like moonlight walks in snowdrifts. Some folks used chamber pots, but most favoured what historians have delicately labelled the behind-a-bush system. In winter, this could mean two things: frostbite or regret. Now, some clever pioneers did get a bit creative. To warm up the bedding before lying down, they might heat a rock in the fire and wrap it in cloth before tucking it beneath the covers. It was like a very slow microwave, if your microwave could also burn your toes. Others sewed bricks into little bags or repurposed empty iron skillets. Anything that could retain heat without setting the wagon on fire was fair game. Of course, a fire inside the wagon was universally frowned upon, unless one's endgame was sudden combustion. Even small stove setups were generally limited to stationary wagons and only in desperate situations. The open prairie didn't exactly come with a fire marshal, but it did come with wind, and lots of it. You haven't really experienced that existential prairie chill until you're staring up at stars through a warping canvas roof, listening to the wind threaten your dinnerware, and wondering whether you'll wake up blanketed in snow or uncertainty. And yet, despite the cold, the sleet, and young Eli's foot wedged permanently between two sacks of molasses, the families managed. That's the strangely beautiful thing about humans in the past. They were astonishingly bad at being comfortable, yet they did it anyway. They bundled up, snuggled close, and dozed off to the soft creaks of wood, the occasional owl, and the sound of snow whispering across the canvas like a lullaby with cold fingers. Somehow, that fragile, freezing wagon felt like home. Soon, we'll pull gently into the pre-dawn hours. When the fire outside has died down to embers, the frost clings like lace to the canvas seams, and someone has to be the first to crawl out into the cold and light the morning fire. The wind was a persistent dinner guest on the Oregon Trail, never officially invited, yet always whispering through the cracks of the canvas-covered wagon, like it had something incredibly important to say about your socks. It didn't. It only wanted your heat. As the calendar trundled toward the late days of November, the wagon party's evening rituals grew cozier and infinitely more ridiculous. Entire families no longer attempted to stretch out. Curled like commas, they nested together for warmth like unbaked cinnamon rolls, flour-dusted and uncertain about their future. Let's step inside one such wagon, shall we? The Monroe family had 6 members, 2 mules, and one cherished cast-iron cookpot that weighed as much as a baby bison. Inside their wagon, space was precious, and fabric was a form of currency. Quilts were piled thick like geological strata, one cottony fossil atop another, and woven wool shawls doubled as privacy curtains, picnic blankets, and surprisingly stylish snoods. At night, the family arranged themselves with mathematical precision. Father Monroe, being broad of shoulder and cursed with the night farts, was assigned the outermost edge near the flap. This allowed for tactical breeze escapes. Mother Monroe, strategic and unsentimental, nestled between 2 of the smaller children, absorbing their radiated body heat like a pioneer hot rock. The children were lettered rather than named to save breath, as they were usually shouted at in bulk anyway. To see, stop wriggling, was more efficient than listing names. Younger children were bundled into what was, frankly, an anthropomorphic sack called a sleeping robe. It was essentially a swaddle for any age, a burlap burrito. You didn't so much sleep in it as surrender to it. Blankets were not owned so much as inherited. If you were lucky, your family had a quilt passed down from a grandmother, hand-stitched with love and lumpy as a jury-rigged cloud. Otherwise, you layered wool traded from a traveller named Lars, who sold them out of a salt barrel and may or may not have made them from scratchy mountain goats with personal vendettas. Inside the wagon, your nose twitched with the musty sweetness of oiled canvas, slightly sour boots, and communal cabbage farts, also known historically as the pioneer lullaby. Outside, the wind skated over the plains in long sighs, tugging occasionally at the wagon's ties like a curious child. Brightness was banned after dark. A lantern could be used if absolutely necessary, but with whale oil scarce and candles melting faster than patience, most families relied on storytelling or complete and utter surrender to the dark. Imagine lying still beside your siblings or cousins, staring upward into the dusky ribs of the wagon canopy, where muffled stars peeked through stitch holes and dreams bled in from the silence. The stories passed around were patched together from whatever leftovers the mind scraped up at night. Bible verses, half-remembered folk tales, and personal accounts of a chicken who once laid 2 yolks and was considered a prophet ever since. If a story was especially good or especially bad, it bought you 1 square foot of blanket real estate and possibly a spare sock for your feet or hands, whichever needed it more urgently. Occasionally, the stillness was broken by external forces. Coyotes gossiping in the distance, wind whistling like a tea kettle stuck on sand, or ice crystals cracking on the water bucket like someone had stepped on a frosty violin. But mostly, there was the quiet. Pioneer quiet. A quiet so complete it pressed in on you like an extra blanket. One that smelled faintly of celery root, pine smoke, and unspoken dreams. You didn't expect comfort in a 2,000-pound rolling box pulled by livestock with boundary issues. Comfort, like soap or privacy, was unpioneery. What you sought was warmth, a shared sense of stubborn gladness, and survival wrapped in domestic absurdity. And of course, socks. As the night deepened, the Monroes drifted one by one into sleep's peculiar embrace. Each turned toward the warmth in their own way. Some clutched family keepsakes. Others whispered nonsense into the woolen dark. And one exceptional boy, listed in family records only as C, kept a hidden biscuit in his sock for emergencies. He would grow up to be a railroad tycoon. Coincidence? Perhaps. But people had done more with less. Outside, the prairie slept too. The stars stood like silent sentries above the makeshift caravan, watching over the frozen canvas humps that dotted the earth, dreaming, if stars do such things, of what it meant to sleep in a moment stretched between yesterday and tomorrow. Now hush, the fire's embers have curled inward, and winter's breath hums steadily along the wagon seams. Let us turn our gaze gently now, just ahead, to the morning, that rare and peculiar thing that followed even the coldest of frontier nights. Snow had begun whispering along the plains by mid-December, that fine sugar dust kind that sneaks in sideways, barely noticed until it's already kissed every inch of canvas and buckboard. Inside the covered wagon, winter's chill didn't politely wait for an invitation. It invited itself right under the flaps and blankets and nestled directly into your bones. Evenings on the great American frontier were not for the thin-blooded. The sun would sink like a gold coin dropping into the pocket of the earth, and as its last light vanished, Cozy fled the scene, gripping its shawl tight. The interior of a wagon would shift dramatically. By day, it was a jostling, cramped caravan. By night, it became a cautious attempt at warmth, family, and mild frostbite. Sleeping arrangements were a delicate form of competitive origami. Entire families, parents, children, a grandmother or two who had zero interest in freezing to death, were expected to fold themselves into whatever space was left between crates, barrels, and the occasional disapproving goat. People slept crosswise, lengthwise, or in what one 1848 journal politely referred to as chaotic symmetry. Feet were tucked wherever they fit, sometimes against your brother's ear or your aunt's rolling pin. You made do. Inside, the only insulation the canvas provided was psychological. The wind blew directly through the cracks in the wood, through the seams of the cloth, through your sense of optimism. Prairie wind is not just weather, it's a personality. It has opinions, usually about how warm you're allowed to feel. Blankets were layered like geological eras, an undersheet that once belonged to someone's cousin in Ohio, a woolen spread that smelled faintly of potatoes from a previous journey, and, if you were lucky, a buffalo robe that weighed more than most toddlers and had, roughly, the same musk. Quilts were works of utilitarian art, sewn by hand, often with patches from dresses, shirts, or flags long retired from any actual usefulness. Each panel told part of a story, though usually one that ended with, "And we were still cold." Of course, fire was entirely out of the question. Lighting one inside a wagon would only reward you with a headline-worthy family tragedy, plus crisp biscuits. Those hoping for heat huddled around a tin lantern, more light than warmth, and whispered inspiring tales like, "When we get to Oregon, we'll have a house with walls." That was frontier optimism at its finest. Betting against the elements, wrapped in leftover curtains pretending to be blankets. Nightwear was a layered affair as well. Pioneers quickly abandoned the Shakespearean romance of nightgowns for the more practical, everything I own that can fit on my body. Men and women both slept in socks, trousers, caps, and sometimes their own regret. Children vanished completely under piles of cloth, occasionally surfacing for air like sock-covered sea turtles. The concept of pajamas, as we know them today, hadn't arrived on American soil yet. And even if it had, pajamas sounded soft, and soft was for cities. You wore what you wore, buttoned up, tucked in, and prayed the raccoon nosing around your supplies didn't think toes looked snacky. As sleep came, it wasn't quiet. Wagons creaked like old men bending to pick up a coin. Canvas flapped like the wings of uncoordinated geese. And the wind sang long notes in a key known only to the coyote and melancholy banjo. Snoring filled what gaps remained, an orchestra of slumbering noses and throats, each one a master of interpretive performance. Sometimes, wagons were circled for protection. You might be nestled a few feet from the smiths, or the very loud millers, separated only by wool and two unspoken rules. Don't steal firewood and leave other people's cornbread alone. You laughed with them during daylight and listened to their sleep sounds when the stars came out. There's intimacy in shared hypothermia. And if you awoke in the night, stirred by a distant wolf, or the unfortunate realization you'd rolled into the pickle barrel, you'd see the soft curve of stars above, and maybe, just maybe, pretend that cold breath spilling from your lips was a dragon snort, rising into a sky of distant fires. As the canvas wagon groaned under the weight of snow fluff and dreams, another morning waited just beyond the frostbitten shivers. But first, there were a few more hours of tangled blankets, whisper-snoring uncles, and the occasional toe kicked in brotherly love. and by the time first light began to stretch its pale arms across the horizon, something else was beginning to stir too. Not just the wagons or the wood smoke, but the yearning for a cup of something warm, something brewed, something that might just unfreeze the conversational parts of your mouth. But before warmth, before journey, before the clatter of wheels and creak of harnesses, one more dream was waiting. Strange, slow, and shaped like a biscuit with legs. As night settled over the endless sweep of prairie grass glazed in frost, the settlers began their usual ritual, turning a rickety, bone-shivering wagon into something that vaguely resembled a bedroom with no walls, or insulation, or privacy. But hey, who needs drywall when you have optimism and several layers of uncomfortable wool? The wind outside whispered like a nosy neighbor through every crack and knothole in the wagon's frame. Covered wagons had canvas tops stretched over bent wooden bows, not exactly the kind of material that holds back Arctic blasts. It was more of a gentle suggestion to the wind rather than a firm "do not enter." The canvas could sag with snow, snap in the cold, and let in drips right onto the heads of the unsuspecting. But it did its best, in the same way our handkerchief does its best during a hurricane. Each family had a different method for stuffing the small wagon with sleeping bodies. There were no set blueprints, just whatever arrangement kept the children warmest and prevented Pa from snoring directly into Ma's ear. Some placed feather beds on the wagon floor. Others rolled out straw and tried to not think too hard about what might be living in it. The luckiest families used buffalo robes, thick, heavy blankets made from actual bison hides, soft on one side, slightly judgmental on the other. Pa might have slept with his boots still on, more out of strategic layering than forgetfulness. There were stories of boots freezing solid by morning if left off the body. Boots transformed into reluctant sculptures. Children bundled into night clothes, which were basically day clothes, but slightly less muddy. Then came the quilt layering, in a method so complex it could have been considered textile origami. One blanket tucked under the shoulders, one over the knees, and the next two crisscrossed like a lattice pie crust of warmth. Getting into bed was not a quiet affair. You might think tiptoeing into slumber in the 1800s was an elegant ordeal. Not really. There was a lot of muffled bumping, a few whispered arguments about who got the itchy corner of the blanket, and a universal understanding that bedtimes were never breezy when the bed was 4 feet by 6, shared by 7 people, and a suspiciously silent dog. Sleep was the goal, but warmth was survival. So hot bricks or iron pans were sometimes heated by fire and wrapped in cloth to serve as DIY bed warmers. These were placed near feet, hands, or wherever numbness had begun to whisper. Come closer, child. A miscalculation, however, could mean scorched bedrolls or feet that smelled oddly of cooked turnips. Still, no one complained if it meant waking without frostbite. Outside, coyotes called out across the night like lonely gossipers, and if you were really lucky, an owl might hoo reassuringly from a nearby cottonwood. Inside, the wagon groaned gently as it cooled from the day's warmth. It creaked like an old man stretching in slow motion, and every sound was familiar. The canvas flap rustling, Ma's sigh, the pop of lantern glass cooling. There was no electricity, of course. No gas heaters or foam insulation or central heating with a handy mobile app. Just the breath of sleeping bodies creating warm pockets under the covers and hope layered between the quilts. You didn't waste time lying awake thinking about how cold you were. You were too busy huddling, shivering strategically with your family quilt motif, usually floral, always emotional. Sometimes, winter's chill came with little warnings carved into the bones of the land. Snowmelt could seep into boots. Ice could nap inside noses. But in the wagon, dreams still bloomed, dreamt beneath the flapping shadows of a restless tarp sky. Children imagined springtime pastures, berry bushes, maybe even towns where you didn't have to sleep against your brother's toes. Pa dreamed of strong horses, dry roads, and socks that didn't feel like sandpaper dipped in regret. And somewhere amid the bundled dreaming, the quietness of true night rolled in. The kind of cold that paused the air. The kind of silence that made even the coyotes forget their monologues. But still, within that fragile little wooden womb rolling across a sleeping continent, life endured. They weren't just surviving the cold. They were choreographing comfort, improvising tenderness, stitching resilience into every shiver. And as the hours slipped deeper and dreams stretched longer, thoughts wandered gently toward the morning and to the odd rituals of breakfast, which, if they were lucky, might involve flapjacks warmed over an actual cow pie fire. But that is a cozy tale for another night. They say silence is golden, but out on the snowy trail in the middle of December 1849, it was more of a frosty silver. The kind that clinks in your nose with every breath and crunches beneath the boots of those still foolish enough to attempt walking to California after sundown. Inside the covered wagon, though, the silence was a different kind entirely. It was the muffled hush of canvas stretched taut against wind, the quiet groan of wood adjusting to the cold, and the sleepy shuffle of feet wrapped in 7 layers of homemade wool socks. It was nighttime on the prairie, and sleep didn't so much arrive as settling cautiously, like a nervous raccoon peeking into a campfire circle. Sleep in a covered wagon was an act of optimism. You hoped to find comfort in a bed made of hay, lumpy quilts, and if you were lucky, the family dog that had wedged itself somewhere between your ankles and the footboard. If you weren't lucky, it wasn't the dog, just your older brother's cold feet. The wagons themselves, charming and iconic in every Western film you've half-watched on a Sunday afternoon, were, in truth, wooden sardine cans with a limp fabric roof. Despite what imagination might tell you, there were no feather mattress luxuries here. No heated blankets or 2-pillow minimums. No firmness settings to speak of unless you count the difference between sleeping on a crate of flour versus a sack of beans. Come midnight, the communal bed inside the wagon became a tangle of humanity, wrapped in threadbare blankets, trying not to elbow each other into unconsciousness. Each family developed an improbable sleeping strategy. Some went head to toe, like an alternating quilt of cold toes and warm breath. Others piled like pancakes, layered for maximum warmth and minimum dignity. No one cared after day 6, and let us not forget the nighttime symphony. Not of crickets, no, they'd frozen hours ago, but of snores, every kind imaginable. Wheezy ones, lumbering ones, a wheezy lumbering hybrid that only Uncle Eli could manage. There were midnight mumbles and sudden sleep coughs, and the occasional shout of "whoa" from grandfather, who, even in dreams, was convinced he was driving the oxen. Now, those covered wagons didn't come with insulation. The canvas offered the thermal protection of a determined napkin. So the real battle wasn't just sleep, it was the rebelling cold. It crept in through the seams, poked through the stitching, and had a nasty habit of licking your ears at 3 a.m. There's a reason pioneers wore nightcaps. Those weren't just for style or bedtime photos, which didn't exist, unless you count very early daguerreotypes of strong-jawed silence. No, nightcaps were the 19th century adult equivalent of saying, "I give up, I live in a sock now." And speaking of socks, many hopefuls packed multiple pairs, thinking them to be the ultimate weapon against the prairie frost. That optimism froze and shattered by week 2. Socks wore thin, then thinner, then vanished into the laundry pile, never to be seen again. Some desperate pioneers knitted new ones from anything they could find: buffalo hair, dog fur, and in one poorly thought-out case, shredded saddlecloth. Outside, the wind howled its jealousy at not having gotten a spot inside. Snowflakes danced silently, performing ghostly arrangements in the moonlight. Wolves padded quietly across the edges of the camp, ever-curious spectators of humanity's frostbitten endurance test. Back inside, the wagon groaned again. Not out of pain, but more of a tired agreement. Somewhere near the back, a child stirred, earning a quick shush from a mother whose only greater fear than freezing was waking the baby. Sleep came in broken chapters, stitched together with shifting shoulders and silent prayers that the quilt covering one's feet would finally stay put. Time itself bent and blurred. There were no ticking clocks, only a kind of internal sundial, a sense of not yet morning, but very much still night. And yet, in that cramped, cold little wooden box pulled by oxen under a sky of frozen stars, there was a curious sort of peace. Perhaps it was the quiet understanding that everyone was equally miserable. Or maybe it was something more eternal, a flickering warmth in knowing that they were daring to chase something better, however foolish, however freezing. With each breath, the canvas-wrapped world outside faded further, and the whispers of sleep coaxed weary travelers deeper into their dreams. Just as somewhere at the east end of camp, a kettle began to whistle against the coals, gently calling all to what would become an altogether peculiar pioneer breakfast. If ever you've wanted to know what it's like to sleep inside a rolling potato sack stuffed with relatives, damp socks, and mild despair, welcome to wagon life in deep winter. Tonight, we're tucking ourselves into the frosty hush of mid-December, somewhere off the wagon trail, where the prairie wind isn't so much blowing as aggressively suggesting you reconsider your choices. The wagon, that humble wooden box on wheels, had about as much insulation as a colander and no central heating, unless you count shared body warmth and the occasional flatulent ox. As the air grew thick with snow and the canvas cover stiffened into something resembling a frozen pie crust, families prepared for another night of bundled slumber, or at least attempted slumber. One did not simply go to bed in a covered wagon. No. First, you wrestled the bedding into shape, a task that felt like trying to fold a jellyfish in a wind tunnel. Most bedding was a combination of homemade quilts, buffalo hides if you had them, or tightly stitched hope. If someone was blessed enough to have a feather mattress, that was communal treasure. More often than not, you'd sleep atop straw. Yes, the same material used as snacks for livestock and slow-motion kindling in the event of a lantern mishap. Before slipping into this chilly nest, settlers employed the subtle art of preheating. Not with hot water bottles, that would have been far too glamorous. No, folks heated bricks or stones in the fire and wrapped them in cloth to drop into the bedding. These makeshift furnaces would keep toes from freezing solid for perhaps 40 to 50 joyous seconds. Now, let us rummage gently through the scene. Uncle Jed snores into a wool blanket that smells faintly of cabbage and hard opinions. Little Emily has wormed her way between Ma and the wagon wall, using her Ma's elbow as a pillow, and somewhere toward the back, wedged behind sacks of cracked corn and at least one dented chamber pot, teenage Josiah practices the age-old ritual of trying not to exist too loudly. Sleep came differently here. It arrived in layers, like sediment or regret. The first layer was exhaustion. Walking 15 miles, cooking on a fire made of buffalo chips, a romantic name for dried poop, and chopping enough wood to offend a forest, that all made the eyelids heavy. But then came the second layer, distraction. The creaking of the canvas overhead, the whistling of wind through wagon spokes, and the faint but unrelenting scent of someone's forgotten cheese. Ma might hum a quiet hymn before drifting off, her voice fragile and low, like moth wings brushing against the side of a lamp. Pa, ever resourceful, would mumble sleepily about mending the axle tomorrow, even though he's been saying it every night since Missouri. Outside, winter's silence blanketed the world. It muffled the nighttime noises, nearby coyotes, distant owls, your cousin snoring with liberty and abandon, and left behind a stillness so complete, it felt like the earth was holding its breath. Breath, by the way, was visible here. You could see it hover above your head in ghostly clouds, like tiny whispers escaping dreams. Incredibly romantic, provided you ignored how many of those clouds carried the unique bouquet of pickled radish and unbrushed historical teeth. The children, too tired to complain, curled up like kittens under quilts stitched by hands they barely remembered. Grandmothers, great aunts, neighbors who'd stayed behind. Those quilts were more than covers. They were memory fragments sewn in thread, binding them to places they could no longer point to on a map. Some were patched brightly with scraps of old shirts or church dresses, each square a little story whispered to the prairie night. Despite the hardships, the cold, the tight quarters, the ever-present scent of damp wool, there was something oddly peaceful in it all. A kind of makeshift intimacy, where shared discomfort softened in tenderness, where the sheer effort it took to survive made the simple experience of lying still next to people you loved enough. And just as the wind slowed and the last glow from the embers faded into soot and stillness, a quiet snuffle from the oxen outside promised just one more reminder that yes, you were still surrounded by animals, but at least tonight they were quieter than Uncle Jed. Tomorrow would bring more snow, more travel, and likely a new draft through the back of the wagon no one would admit to noticing. But for now, all was calm, or calm enough to drift into rest. And before dawn reached over the horizon with its pale winter fingers, a new layer of frost would lace the wagon's canvas like sugar on a confection, and the hush of the prairie would wrap them all again in sleep. We'll dream next of what the travelers ate to stay warm, if you can call it food, and how beans could defy both gravity and polite society in the hours before sunrise. Wind whistled like an old gossip through the canvas walls of the covered wagon, nosing around for warmth, finding none, and moving along in search of juicier secrets. Inside, calloused fingers fumbled in the dark, attempting to tie off a lantern wick that had long since given up the ghost. No one wanted light at this hour, not in the brittle heart of a prairie winter night. Light meant moving, and moving meant cold. It was safer to lie still, huddled under a mound of scratchy quilts and questionable decision-making. Out on the open trail in the 1800s, where flat plains reflected moonlight like polished silence, nighttime belonged not just to the stars, but to the old, lumbering dreams of settlers too tired to dream properly. Wagon life encouraged a curious sort of sleep, half shiver, half slumber, punctuated regularly by snoring, creaking oak, and the accusing stare of a mule who had understood none of your life's choices. Getting ready for bed in a wagon during winter was less of a ritual and more of a battle plan. First, all boots were removed with the gentle urgency of a man disarming a cannon. You did not bring a muddy boot near the sleeping quilts unless you wanted to be voted off the prairie. Washing up thoroughly was a luxury reserved for days when your face didn't freeze before you reached the water basin. So most opted for the classic 1800s strategic rinse, splashing just enough icy water on the face to feel alive, but not enough to threaten your overall friendship with winter. Clothing presented a moral dilemma. Every part of you wanted to take off the damp trousers and unbutton the woolen flannel clutched tightly to your chest. But every other part of you, mainly your entire survival instinct, begged you not to. That freezing apron of darkness outside did not care how itchy your drawers were. Most people slept in their clothes, boots tucked near the warming stones if you had any, or otherwise used in the eternal dance of how do I stop my feet from becoming ice cubes? If your family was lucky, or particularly paranoid, you might have brought along a foot stove. This delightful contraption was a little box, one filled with hot coals, slid beneath the bedding, and then promptly regretted if not monitored closely, lest you fall asleep and wake to find that your left foot had abandoned ship. Warming rocks were safer, though spectacularly unspectacular. One simply placed them close to the fire before bed, then wrapped them in cloth and pretended, against all reason, that they felt something like comfort. The truth is, most were barely warm enough to distinguish from pet rocks, and you couldn't even name them, because admitting emotional attachment to a lukewarm stone was somehow even more embarrassing when your teeth were chattering. Inside the wagon, the space exhaled warmth unevenly. Those lucky enough to sleep closest to the center basked in the delicate luxury of being slightly less miserable. Along the wagon's ends, where cold seeped in like a petty argument, toes took on that familiar blue-grey hue settlers affectionately referred to as frost pessimism. Privacy, of course, was as extinct as unicorns. Entire families slept elbow to earlobe on straw-ticking mattresses flattened from months of use and the occasional unintended porcupine encounter. Anyone attempting to roll over had to declare intentions well in advance, lest they trigger a full-bodied avalanche of quilts and 6 people's worth of irritated grumbling. And then there were the sounds. The symphony of life in a wooden tent. Wagons made of sturdy oak, lashed with iron and faith, had a way of complaining constantly like a grandparent left alone too long at bingo. Floorboards groaned with each minuscule movement. The canvas whistled. Horses outside snorted in their sleep, dreaming of greener pastures and considerably less emotional labor. If the wind died down, and your thoughts did too, you might find yourself lulled by the rhythmic breathing of kin, the soft settling of iron pots above your head, and the comforting weight of a night spent surviving. Nothing moved quickly, nothing demanded explanation. It was, at last, still. And just as your mind began to drift softly beyond the flapping edges of canvas, a low, thunderous pop from the freezing wood shook your senses most impolitely. Someone cursed under their breath, and a sibling laughed in their sleep. The quiet reclaimed its territory. In the breathe-in hum of that moment, you lay perfectly still, wondering, not for the first time, how humans ever decided this was the best way west. The temperature outside dropped with all the grace of a piano falling through snow. But inside, beneath quilts that smelled faintly of firewood, wool, and frontier dreams, Warmth grew in shapes that didn't need geometry to make sense. And as sleep tiptoed in with moccasin feet and lanternless hands, your thoughts slowly curled toward the comfort of another dim-lit ritual soon to come. An early morning awakening in a frozen world, chasing warmth once more. By the middle of December, the prairie had surrendered its final colors to snow and silence. The horses no longer whinnied with enthusiasm, but seemed to sigh through their noses, while impatiently munching icicles off the canvas flaps. Smoke from the evening cook fire curled thick and blue, then flattened into the cold air like a lazy thought. And under the wool blankets, in the back of a creaking frosted wagon, families tucked themselves in like mismatched spoons in a pewter drawer. It was in this season that the pioneers perfected the fine art of not freezing to death in their sleep. They used every available trick, habit, and bit of homespun wizardry they could conjure. And somehow, improbably, much like a pot of beans that boils longer than expected, nobody quite knew how. It seemed to work. Now, cuddling for warmth was less a romantic notion and more a logistical necessity. Children were stacked in layers, sorted if possible, by radiance of body heat. There were unspoken charts in every household. Silas burned hot, so he was planted squarely in the center. Margie was a bit clammy, so she got the wool sock hat and her position closer to the outer flap. It wasn't favoritism, it was physics. The adults, well, they were usually at the edges, both to maintain the structural dignity of the family blanket pile, and because they were expected to wake up first and poke various things, mainly fires, stoves, and maybe a reluctant rooster if they had one. Sleeping attire became less about fashion and more about inventory. Flannel, wool, and fur all had their say. Women sometimes slept in as many as 4 layers, a chemise, 2 petticoats, and a shawl wound around the head like a questionably stylish turban. Men went to bed in long johns, which, by winter's demand, evolved into longer and practically floor-length johns, sometimes with patches upon the patches, which let you know this wasn't their first cold rodeo. Slumber itself became segmented. Nights were lengthy, the darkness stretching out like a cat on a warm windowsill. People often slept in 2 phases. The first sleep, sometime from sundown to midnight, and then a second one, from a bit past midnight until dawn. And in between? Oh, the mysterious middle of the night. That sacred pocket of quiet when people would stoke the coals, sip something warm, pray slowly, or, if they were really living on the edge, write in a journal. A journal, by the way, whose pages were probably curling from dampness and the occasional smear of wind-blown stew. This break in the night wasn't seen as a disorder, but a rhythm, natural and expected. Some even believed first and second sleep allowed the spirit to rise and settle again, with the mind freshened like a fluffed featherbed. And what about bedbugs? Yes, those wily little secrets of the night. They're the unsung villains of 19th century bedtime, not nearly as romantic as frostbite, but fiercely loyal to the fabric of wagon life. Colonists waged quiet wars against them with vinegar, petroleum, and sheer denial. Many claimed they didn't exist. That is, until they rolled over and met a 6-legged diplomat scrambling across the bedpost. And the wagons themselves, the rolling cradles of civilization, weren't exactly designed for comfort. In winter, the canvas tops stiffened like old newspapers, and the wooden wheels groaned like bad knees. Every gust of wind tested the seams. Families would line the inner edges with quilts, like medieval tapestry, but more likely to smell faintly of onions. These makeshift wall hangings trapped what precious little warmth existed, and gave some sense that you were sleeping inside a home, not a glorified cereal box on wheels. Even dreams had to get creative to thrive in such chilly conditions. Imagine trying to conjure yellow meadows and warm sun, only to have your nose frost over mid-dream. More than one pioneer claimed to have dreamed of Jamaica, possibly because their brains were doing all they could to ignore reality. It wasn't all suffering, though. There was togetherness, the sound of soft breathing in the quiet dark, the shuffle of someone seeking another blanket, the muffled giggle from a child too cold to sleep and inventing a story in a whisper. Moments like lanterns, small, dim, but glowing enough to feel the promise of spring. Now the fire is low, and someone, perhaps you, might just be drifting toward your own second sleep. But just before your eyelids close, let's take one more quiet look at how Wagon families greeted the whispering snow beyond the flaps. It was a strange truth of Wagon life that, even in the coldest throes of winter, privacy was a rare and exotic creature, spoken of in hushed tones like unicorns or pre-warmed bedsheets. In the covered wagon, space was not a luxury. Space was more of a shared hallucination, an optimistic illusion that perhaps, just maybe, your brother's elbow would not spend the entire night living inside your right kidney. Inside the wagon, beneath the pale canvas bowed like a snow-muffled cave, the family huddled like a pile of mismatched socks, limbs tangled, blankets layered, and everyone deeply devoted to the sacred cause of body heat. Now, the blankets, yes, the beloved heap, known as nighttime insulation. These were less like blankets and more like ancient, itchy battlements. Roughly woven wool, old quilts that smelled faintly of chimney smoke and pickles, and buffalo robes heavy enough to suppress feelings, dreams, and certain minor internal organs. You see, there was no such thing as too many layers. If you could still move your arms freely, you had not yet achieved true warmth. Though the air inside the wagon crystallized with each exhale, and frost occasionally gathered like a ghost army on the inner canvas walls, that tiny cocoon of shared breath and elbows was warmer than anywhere else in the world, unless, of course, your brother stirred in the middle of the night and flung the buffalo robe off as if repelling a sleep demon, which he often did. Beyond the practical battle with cold, there remained the noble mission of staying asleep, a valiant undertaking in a wagon that groaned, creaked, and grumbled through the night like an aging sea vessel. The wind would whistle through any unsealed seam, playing ghostly harmonicas in the gloom. Critters outside, and sometimes inside, tried out nighttime solo performances. Coyotes, keen on lullabies of lamentation. The family dog, positioned strategically at the foot of the bed pile, huffed and shifted with the gravity of an old man adjusting his retirement portfolio. And yet, amid the noise, soot-streaked air, and a mattress situation best described as bottomless potato sack over lumpy hope, slumber was possible. It simply asked for creativity and a robust capability for ignoring your own discomfort. Many 19th century travelers had their own sleep rituals. Some whispered prayers, some hummed songs passed down through generations. Others, like the McAllen sisters of the Nebraska Trail, kept a diary under their pillow, scribbling entries by lantern light with fingers too numb to properly hold the pen. Their diary pages would sometimes freeze and snap upon closing. Still, better to lose a page than a thought. At the back of the wagon, grandmothers were often found wrapped in shawls that had seen 2 wars, 3 blizzards, and at least 1 dinner party. They watched over the bunch like owls wrapped in knit armor. dozing with one eye open, the way women often do when they've earned the right to never miss anything important, even in their sleep. Around them all hung the smell of the wagon, stale canvas, damp wool, simmered beans, and a hint of kerosene from the lantern, if lucky. These odours, layered in the stillness of night, became strangely comforting, like a scent-based lullaby reminding you that while the world outside was howling in sub-zero fury, you here were wrapped in family and fabric that had never once considered giving up. And if you happened to be sharing your blanket pile with cousin Ephraim, whose snoring sounded like a bear losing at horseshoes, well, that was simply part of the adventure. A reminder that in the wild stillness of the frontier, companionship was rarely quiet, but always warm. Sometimes a child would wake and whisper a question no adult could quite answer. Something about stars or the afterlife, or whether snow had feelings. And the answer, always murmured softly and slowly, was usually something just shy of nonsense. But it was enough. The darkness was kind in that way. It made all answers feel true. What broke the silence most often, however, was the fire dying down. Even with the stove, if you had one, the embers would eventually retreat, and someone, usually whoever looked most awake, which was always somehow Mother, would rise, apron slung over a nightgown, and shuffle out into the bitter dark to stir it back to life. The wind would bite. The snow would try to sneak in through every seam and edge. But the fire would rise again, because it had to. And so the night rolled on, cold, dark, and still, with stories sleeping beneath quilts and dreams huddled between frozen breaths. As dawn prepared to flirt with the frost-rimmed horizon, let's slip deeper into this wool-wrapped world, where tin mugs rattle, fires sigh, and biscuits wait unbaked just over the next hill. The crackle of wind against canvas had become the official lullaby of the journey. Each night, it hummed lullingly through the seams of the wagon, like a ghost politely asking to borrow a blanket. And in the rigid heart of winter, under a sky stitched with frozen stars, every creak of the plaid-covered wagon felt like the Old West gently whispering, "Good luck sleeping, partner." By now, our humble pioneer family had developed a routine as sacred as any prairie sunrise. Huddled beneath wool blankets that had once enjoyed the bragging rights of being moth-free, they'd taken to layering as if trying to impersonate a small, unbaked soufflé. Flannel over linen, socks over other socks, and, on particularly unforgiving nights, a twist of desperation in the form of a livestock-warmed shawl. Yes, little Bessie the cow sometimes doubled as a four-legged furnace. A moving heat source, if you will. But as much as warmth was prized, silence almost outranked it. And the winter nights, oh, they were silent in that unnerving way that made you feel like the trees might be listening. No whippoorwills, no crickets, no distant wheels. Just the sound of people trying not to acknowledge that someone had, once again, eaten beans for dinner. Inside their wooden and cloth abode, the walls seemed to shrink in the cold, pulling people and supplies closer like the wagon itself was tensing up. And in that tucked-in intimacy, folks began to find companionship in odd places. A flannel cap became a roommate. A dry biscuit became a sentry stationed by the bedroll. Even the stove, now embers glowing like sleepy fireflies, earned affectionate nicknames: Emberton, Sparky, and once, after too many potato peels were burned in his little belly, Sir Crispalot. The matter of sleep, though, ah yes, that elusive prize. It was something you settled into slowly out here, less slipping into slumber, more bargaining with it. First, you'd promise to rotate the soup pot less often. Then you'd vow to stop blaming the dog for every unpleasant smell. Eventually, bundled and resigned, you'd close your eyes and drift into a sleep peppered with flapping canvas sounds, Grandpa's nasal haikus, and dreams of an especially warm buffalo robe. Unlike today's world, rich with memory foam and cloud-branded mattresses, the 1800s understood sleep more philosophically. Comfort was a passing guest, and sleep came because you built a ritual sturdy enough to welcome it, same as patching the wagon wheel or folding your britches over a log to avoid a mysterious nighttime bugs. The more you respected its fickle nature, the kinder it became, and in those stillest moments, just before a dream journey to some imaginary hot spring in San Francisco, there'd sometimes be a whisper from the wind, a sourceless tone that sounded almost like the murmurs of neighbors 3 wagons over. Were they whispering about you? Or maybe about that time you lost the cornbread inside the bedding and only found it 3 days later? The prairie, cold and moody as it could be, also had a soft spot. Sometimes snow muffled the ground outside so well that even a sneeze from the ox went unheard. Children, swaddled in so many layers they resembled sluggish potatoes, occasionally giggled themselves to sleep, simply remembering that Ma's hair had frozen into a curl cycle during tonight's trip to the latrine. And as often as sleep was evasive, it was also generous. Those who'd rocked to the rhythm of wagon wheels by day often found that their dreams kept rolling across hills, through snowbanks, deep into storyscapes stitched with tall tales and taller stacks of imaginary pancakes. For now, though, under boughs of frost-rimmed canvas and surrounded by the quiet sighs of sleeping siblings, the Wagon family relaxed into the calm certainty that there were few things more noble or more drafty than frontier bedtime. Just as the last ember of Emberton, the stove gave a bashful glow and spat a tiny hiss of smoke, the night's narrative curled inward, ready to make room for dreams, and with the sound of a faint owl in the distance, who, let's be honest, seemed to have learned everything via correspondence course, the world pressed faintly on. Somewhere out there, a new moon made a curtain call behind the clouds, and just beyond the flap of the wagon, something stirred, not loud enough to worry anyone, just enough to suggest that a new sort of night challenge might soon be crawling, musically, into their dreams. By the time January had scrunched its frozen feet beneath the skirts of the prairie-bound wagons, life inside those canvas-covered trailers had become, monotonously brisk. The kind of brisk that made your eyelashes feel like tiny icicles and your breath perform interpretive dance routines in the frosty air. Sleep did not come easily, but when it did, it wrapped pioneers in that deeply appealing blanket of, I may never feel my toes again, but at least I'm horizontal. Inside the wagon, nighttime was an elaborate performance of pre-industrial sleep strategy, a choreography of human nesting behavior that ranged from artful snuggling to desperate pile formation. Each night, families would pile into their rolling shelter, creating awkward mounds of elbows, knees, and flannel. Privacy was minimal, warmth was critical, and dignity was optional. The beds were less beds and more, if you flatten enough hay and lie still, this counts as a mattress. If you were lucky, your bedding hadn't frozen solid during the day. If unlucky, well, you simply wedged yourself between 2 sensible relatives and hoped for the best. Everyone slept in their day clothes, several layers of which had hit the stage of development known as permanently seasoned. Socks were rarely removed. It wasn't personal hygiene. It was survival accessorizing. To keep warm, some families resorted to the pioneering marvel known as the heated brick. You'd place a flat rock or brick near the campfire in the evening, heat it until it radiated like a smug sun, then tuck it beneath the bedding to serve as a primitive space heater. By midnight, it had usually cooled to resemble a particularly judgmental glacier fragment, but legends claimed those first 30 warm minutes were bliss. One mustn't forget the hot water bottle, a less glamorous cousin of the heated brick. Pioneers used sturdy glass or metal containers filled with hot water, carefully capped and wrapped in cloth. These were cradled like small, scalding pets, great for warming toes, risky for surprise burns. They were passed around like heirlooms, admired for their utility and feared for their occasional betrayal. Many wagons, in fact, cultivated a sort of family bedtime mythology, rituals and wisdoms on the art of surviving the cold. Children were instructed to sleep curled like cinnamon rolls, with hands tucked under armpits and feet seeking the belly warmth of a sibling. Parents would whisper bedtime stories not of mythical beasts or fairy queens, but of someone named Uncle Wallace, whose fingers turned white just once because he went out to relieve himself barefoot. The cautionary tale genre was strong on the prairie. The notion of going outside the wagon during a winter's night, particularly for bodily functions, deserved its own Greek tragedy. There was the legendary chamber pot, often just a bucket with dreams. It lived in the corner of the wagon, and during frozen nights was valued more than gold, horses, or thrilling conversation. In mixed company, its use was elegantly not discussed. Eyes were averted. Polite humming ensued. Nobody looked at the corner for at least 15 minutes. Outside, stars glittered cruelly above the frost-bitten land, chortling in their celestial way, while wind hooted through thin plank crevices in search of wayward noses. The wind, frankly, was a drama queen, with no respect for sleep schedules. It liked to whistle ominously under the wagon wheels, flirt with the horses' manes, and occasionally scream through the camp like a ghost sheet that missed Halloween and was making up for lost time. But despite the cold, the noise, the general absence of insulation or personal space, a kind of hypnotic rhythm took hold. The gentle creak of the wagon frame in the wind became a lullaby. The muffled breathing of an entire uprooted life, children, parents, tin kettles, formed a womb-like soundscape, and as the candle stub near the flap guttered out, final sighs softened into the hush of shared surrender. Some folks would dream of home, of soft feather beds and warm porridge. Others dreamed forward, imagining cabins with stone hearths and quilt-lined parlors, just as drafty, but gloriously stationary. Either way, the cold had a knack for nudging fantasies into vivid technicolor. The harder the wind blew, the sweeter the warm places of the mind became. And so the wagon quieted, a small slumbering boat adrift in a sea of white silence, while the fire outside fizzled gently into orange crumbs. The sky pressed down with a tender weight, stars blinking their lullabies again, and the vast wild west slumbered on, curled against itself in the frost. Next, the morning light will creep in, timid, pale, and extremely unimpressed with everyone's frost-covered eyelashes. But for now, the stillness deepens, and sleep holds tight its thawing spell. As the sun dipped below the ragged teeth of the distant Rockies, golden light spilled across the icy prairie, gilding every frostbitten blade of grass in temporary warmth before nightfall crept in once more. The bonnet of the covered wagon, stretched taut over its wooden ribs, had already turned brittle with cold, like a sheet of parchment left too long by the hearth. Inside, the snug world was preparing for another night of frontier repose, which is an old-timey way of saying trying not to freeze solid while sleeping next to an iron stove like a cinnamon roll of desperate humanity. Now, the evening's first task was unrolling the bedding, which, in the 1800s, was neither fluffed nor soft enough to tempt a cat. Mattresses, if you could generously call them that, were canvas ticks stuffed with straw. Yes, straw. The same thing horses eat and scarecrows wear. But when your spine is more used to jostling across ruts and riverbeds than anything resembling comfort, even straw tick bedding began to feel like the embrace of feathered angels. Lumpy, hay-scented angels, but angels all the same. Parents usually tucked the children in first. Small bodies meant they lost heat fast, so the wee ones were swaddled up like sausages in bedding, or layers of wool and cotton blankets stiffened with cold and history. Quilts were prized, homemade, patched from old dresses, grain sacks, and scraps salvaged from the optimistic ghost of warmer times. Each square carried a story, stitched with hands that had churned butter, wrangled livestock, and delivered 6 children and a loaf of bread all before breakfast. Once, the little ones were mummified into submission and had stopped giggling about the pungent antifreeze properties of Dad's feet. The adults would settle in, curling themselves into the most tolerable configuration the narrow bed space allowed. Elbows would jab, shins would duel. Someone would inevitably inhale a face full of someone else's bonnet. All the while, the little cast-iron stove crackled softly, its fragile heat eking out into the chill like a candle trying to warm a cathedral. These miniature marvels were a winter blessing and an anxiety-inducing fire hazard. They belched smoke with regal indifference. Every coal fed into their belly a prayer of survival. In the dark hours, one could hear the shifting metal tick and sigh as it did its best to impersonate a hearth. The stovepipe, snaking upward through the canvas roof like a determined earthworm, sometimes leaked a haze of soot into the air, making everything smell faintly of roasted cornmeal and desperation. Despite the cramped cold, or perhaps because of it, the wagon became something oddly magical by night. Outside, snow whispered across the plains, coyotes yipped their lullabies to the moon, and the stars spread out like spilled sugar, stretching from one edge of the world to the other. But inside the wagon, the world shrank down to a few warm bodies and the creak of wood bracing against the wind. Time had a different flavor in those hours. People didn't rush sleep like we do now. They eased into it. First with stories, tales from back east, of bustling towns with gas lamps and real theatres where ladies wore gloves just for fun, or ghost stories where spectres drifted across the plains in search of lost mail and warmer climates. Then came the prayers, murmured softly, sometimes beside still mouths and tucked hands, with the same likely closing line, "And please, Lord, keep the fire lit and the wolves uninterested." As slumber pulled its gentle shroud over the wagon, subtle sounds took the stage. The deep breathing of a draft animal tied close by, the flap of the wagon's canvas wall shifting in a lazy breeze, and from somewhere near the stove, the slow, certain rattle of Grandpa's spectacular snore. It started soft, like a distant locomotive, then built into something magnificent, half-roaring bear, half-windmill in disrepair. Despite the occasional flailing elbow or the creeping cold inching through seams, sleep came. Not luxurious, but whole, full-bodied and heavy, the kind that thickened you into the mattress and made dreaming feel optional. All the while, a new frost formed just inches above on the canvas ceiling, catching leftover breath and memories of laughter. tiny crystals in suspended animation, waiting patiently for the sun's next chide. And just past the rim of dawn's cold light, something stirred. A bundle of old socks and ambition, with a mind to fix the stubborn stove lid come morning. Out on the prairie, beneath a vault of stars so crisp they look stitched into the night sky, the world in winter made sounds only silence could teach. Little creaks of frozen timber, the soft whisper of wind testing the canvas, horses shifting faintly in their frost-dusted sleep. All these quiet noises pooled around the covered wagon like a lullaby sweetened with hardship. By the time the Utah Territory was welcoming settlers of adventurous, or arguably confused disposition, winter on the trail had become both a feared and familiar houseguest. Not unlike your Aunt Mildred, who insists on bringing her own pillow, her parrot, and a strongly worded opinion about your life choices. Winter, much like Aunt Mildred's parrot, would settle in loudly and without invitation. Inside the covered wagon, night was a theatre of improvisation. Picture, if you will, a family of 5, possibly 6 if you count that eternally grumpy cat, Hobbs, trying to sleep in a space smaller than your average modern elevator. The mother wrapped in her shawl, the father in a beard that now doubled as insulation, and the children bundled like baked potatoes in patchwork quilts, with only tufts of hair and the occasional snore betraying their presence. It's important to remember that the walls of the wagon, canvas stretched taut over oak boughs, weren't exactly well insulated. In fact, the canvas was, let's call it, optimistically thin. It kept out the sharper snowflakes, most birds, and the intense stares of passing crows. But it wasn't winning any awards for thermal engineering. So families got clever. They hung extra blankets along the sides, saved coals in warming pans, even tucked heated river stones at their feet inside the bedrolls, stones which, incidentally, had to be absolutely confirmed not snake-occupied before heating, as one might imagine. But the real warmth came not from rocks or quilts. It came from body heat and from closeness. That delightfully awkward elbow to the kidneys comfort you'd find only by pressing against your entire family like a human sandwich of survival. Babies were clutched close to the chest. Toddlers were strategically placed as warm pillows. It was, somewhat ironically, not unlike a 19th century Scandinavian spa weekend, minus the spa, the weekend, or any consensus on the existence of fun. Now, a muffled cough might break the night, or the wind would reach under the wagon's axle like a curious ghost, teasing out a sock carelessly dropped. Yet inside, most slept on, soothed by the rhythm of fatigue and the bravely optimistic thought that morning would bring both thaw and coffee. Coffee which, depending on supply levels, might actually be boiled oak bark, or reused grounds repurposed so many times they started applying for retirement. Caffeine, at that point, was mostly theology. Every so often, someone might wake just enough to stoke a tiny stove, if indeed a stove was part of the wagon's luxuries. Small iron stoves were an upgrade more often found among wealthier emigrants, the upper crust of the roadside nomad society. For the rest, simple tin lanterns cast dancing shadows, and sometimes, with the help of a tin cup or two, could be made into a whisper-warm heater. You'd be amazed what counted as toasty when your winter insulation included a wool sock shared by 2 cousins and a hopeful attitude. Of course, keeping the fire going in the night wasn't just about staying warm. It was also insurance against unwelcome visits, coyotes, curious bears, and even less savory 2-legged visitors all respected flame. Only the most determined nighttime nuisances would brave a glowing wagon, and most of them, thankfully, came in the form of dreams. A distant wolf in the mind, padding across memory and meadows alike. Wrapped tight, someone's hand would twitch in dreamt confusion, thoughts slipping toward the memory of a hearth left behind. One with a rocking chair and a neatly stacked pile of wood that never disappeared overnight. Perhaps in dreams, they were back in Boston, or Pittsburgh, or somewhere near the Mississippi River, marveling at how many kinds of mud a single child could wear all at once. Sometimes, the dreams turned funny enough to elicit a quiet, unconscious chuckle. These were moments when history itself smiled, a little secret hiccup of joy under a blanket quilted in both love and itchy wool. Outside, winter waited with all the patience of a cold librarian, but inside, hope was being reheated for breakfast. And as the stars traced their patient arcs across the sky, the wind began to calm, content for the moment not to prove its point. The time was drawing near for another morning under layers of frost, flapjacks, and perhaps a surprise visit from raccoons with boundary issues. But for now, the warmth held, the fire stubbed in its belly, and sleep, like smoke through pine, began to settle again. The wagon's canvas, old and seasoned by time, let out a soft flap in the wind, like an elderly murmuring in their sleep. Outside, the frost crept silently, drawing floral graffiti on the tin cups left too close to a window flap. But inside was another world, warmer, quieter, a suspended moment in time stitched together with patchwork quilts, smoky breath, and the rustle of woolen socks against buffalo hide rugs. The travelers of the great American wagon trails were not mere passengers of history. They were reluctant experts in the art of motionless misery. By December, the prairie winds howled through the gaps of poorly corked boards, and the insides of wagons turned into small igloos lined faintly with fur, cloth, and the sort of optimism only possible when denial is both a lifestyle and a survival tactic. At night, when all one could hear was the occasional high-pitched whinny of a dreaming mule or the eerie silence of 20 frozen biscuits, families huddled close together on their makeshift beds which, under modern scrutiny, would rank somewhere between wooden shelves and textile pancakes. Bedtime rituals, though simple, were sacred. One didn't merely go to bed. One prepared for it like entering a spiritual contract. First came the fire, if there was any fuel left. Buffalo chips, which I regret to inform you are exactly what they sound like, were sometimes brought indoors to stoke a small warmth. Just a handful, inserted into the miniature stove with the reverence of a bishop lighting a candle. More often than not, however, the fire was more of a hypothetical than an actual source of heat, a plain desire flickering in the corner. Once one had talked oneself into believing the fire might eventually warm the air. Comfort was forged through layers. Nightwear consisted of every piece of clothing the person owned, including, but not limited to, yesterday's trousers used as leg warmers, Aunt Martha's petticoats as headscarves, and mittens acting as supplementary socks. Someone always had to wear the dog for warmth, and the dog didn't seem to mind much, so long as it wasn't the cat. The thick quilts were heirlooms, stuffed with goose down, if you had geese. Otherwise, other things were stuffed inside: flannel scraps, old newspaper, sometimes hay if desperation outpaced logic. These were laid over a base layer of straw, a few ticking mattresses if you were lucky, and entire generations of bed bugs who'd already staked their claim on the territory. Cleanliness wasn't ignored, it was just postponed indefinitely. Washing up before bed meant cracking a layer of ice off the top of your water bucket, usually with your forehead because your hands had lost feeling somewhere around sunset. Teeth were brushed for Christmas and possibly weddings. Morning breath, however, had nothing on "I just slept with 3 family members and a goat in the same blanket" breath. Within the walls of the wagon, bedtime sounds rose like a lullaby conducted by someone who had clearly never heard music. Snoring, of course, but also creaking joints, both wood and human. The occasional sigh from someone who remembered porridge and murmured prayers that bordered on passive-aggressive complaints to the Almighty. Children, jammed between parents and siblings like human Tetris pieces, had the unique advantage of staying warm through sheer compression. Elders, however, often slept on the outside edge of the family blob, their loyalty to family manifesting through exposure to sub-zero temperatures and the occasional toe lost to frostbite. They rarely complained, but they did become experts at glaring. Now and then, curiosity struck between shivers. A child might ask, soft and sleepy, "Why can't we just stop for the winter in a town?" And their mother, brewing sleep and kindness with the same spoon, would whisper something gently evasive like, "Because someday we will own land, child." A promise as vague as it was powerful, passed down like a bedtime story that everyone wanted to believe in. And so, they slept. Not deeply, not comfortably, and rarely all at the same time. But they slept nevertheless, dreaming of horse hooves on soft earth, of warm bread in someone else's kitchen, and of that mythical house yet to be built, furnished not with frozen wheels and hay beds, but real floors, a stove that worked, and an attic free of livestock. Tomorrow, if fortune smiled and no axle split beneath the snow, morning would arrive with its usual grudge. One more day closer to somewhere. But tonight, the wind merely hummed around the wagon like a worried aunt, while inside, 100 small dreams unfolded quietly beneath the patchwork calm of winter on the trail. In the distance, the sound of something stirring, perhaps a coyote, or perhaps just next morning's bacon thawing in someone's dreams. With a quiet groan and the reluctant creak of dry wood joints, the sunbeds of the covered wagon, more plank than pillow, greeted the weary settler each winter night like an elder who never quite warmed to hugs. Yet, over time, what had started as a stiff surface became, well, slightly less stiff. The human body is a remarkable thing. Give it enough repetition, low expectations, and a few layers of buffalo hide, and it'll swear it's found comfort. By midwinter, most wagon families had perfected the nighttime preparation ritual, which resembled a choreographed dance performed entirely in mittens. First came the hay-stuffed ticks. No, not the bloodthirsty kind one dreads, but ticks, as in mattress bags filled with dry straw, or, if you'd struck pioneer gold, goose down. These were shaken, patted, and occasionally fluffed with theatrical flair. Then came the layering, a cascade of wool blankets, patched quilts, and anything not currently occupied by livestock or toddlers. Inside the wagon's canvas dome, breath hung in the air like tiny ghosts, whispering secrets before fading. The fire had long since been damped outside, lest a spark decide to turn the whole expedition into a wood-fired disaster. Now, all warmth came from shared human heat, and the occasional foot warmer, which was just a tin can filled with hot coals, courage, and poor life choices. One misplaced toe, and you'd feel like you'd tangoed with a stovepipe. Night cloaked the prairie like a second canvas. Beyond the flaps of the wagon, the silence was almost sacred, broken only by the far-off howl of a coyote or the suspicious thump of something large doing its best not to be seen. But within, families lay bundled together in their sleep sack city, lined up like fingers in a particularly chilly glove. Children, often immune to the concept of personal space, tended to rotate freely during the night. This meant you might drift off to the soothing sound of your eldest daughter humming and wake to find a tiny foot exploring the inside of your ear. Privacy, on that frosty frontier stage, was a vague and theoretical concept, something that existed only in European novels or among prairie dogs. If someone snored, everyone knew. If someone passed gas, it was cause for trial by jury. And if someone managed to read a Bible verse by candlelight without setting the canvas aflame, they were deemed a saint. There were, of course, the nocturnal interruptions. A rickety lurch of the wagon as the wind jabbed beneath the wheels. A late-night trip outside to inquire diplomatically where the chamber pot had wandered off to. Or the anxious whisper of a child who dreamed of mountain lions, although the mountain lions were probably also dreaming of warmer places and settlers who tasted less like Long Johns. Yet, even with all its discomforts, the wagon's nighttime became its own sort of symphony. The creak of the boards, the rustle of quilt shifting, the steady cadence of breathing, interrupted periodically by a sneeze or someone muttering, "Who took my sock?" All of it folded into the invisible quilt of shared survival. Mothers, ever the watchful midnight sentries, often lay awake a little longer. They'd listen for coughs that might hint at trouble or feel for bare feet that needed to be tucked back in, often with hands chapped but uncomplaining. Fathers, on the other hand, usually pretended sleep more convincingly than they achieved it, their minds wandering to split axles, dwindling flour, and how it had come to pass that squirrels kept outwitting them so thoroughly. The youngest children, particularly those born along the trail and unfamiliar with anything softer than pine needles, simply slept. They wrapped themselves around moth-eaten stuffed animals, or, you guessed it, errant cabbages, and dreamed the nonsensical dreams of children, where bears say please and wagons sprout wings. And above it all, the canvas roof sagged slightly inward, gathering snow like a sleeping shawl. The wagons from the outside looked like stitched-together snowdrifts, napping in a frozen ocean of prairie. Inside, tenacious, snuggled life. Outside, the wind telling its long, frosty epics to no one in particular. The cold did not disappear, but it became familiar, spoken of with the grudging affection one might give a tiresome neighbor. And by the time eyelids drifted closed and the rhythmic breathing resumed, the covered wagon was less a vehicle and more a cocoon, a hibernating beetle of wood and wool dreaming westward. Just beyond the curtain of dawn, soft changes were already tumbling down the trail. But tonight, quiet settled in like an old friend unpacking a storybook. Wind whispered through the cotton duck canvas that formed the stretched, curving walls of the covered wagon, fluttering like a polite ghost checking in on its tenants. Inside, under layers of patchwork quilts and woolen wraps, the Richter family lay tucked in like a warm stack of sleepy pancakes. Ma Richter's nightly snore, measured and unwavering, served as the family's unofficial lullaby, syncopating against the occasional whistle from the stovepipe. It was the middle of a prairie winter, that most unforgiving house guest, the kind whose idea of hospitality was to swing the doors open and let the chill do the talking. Outside, the world was quiet, in that stilled, snow-muted way only a frontier winter can achieve. Nothing moved except the stars, winking overhead, with the unimpressed patience of celestial librarians. Now, You might be wondering why a family would choose to sleep in a glorified wooden cart, parked in the middle of an icy nowhere, in a century not known for its insulation technology. Well, simply put, because there weren't a great many 4-star hotels between Fort Laramie and the Idaho Territory. Covered wagons weren't just transportation. They were multifunctional marvels of pioneer minimalism. Your ride, your kitchen, your bedroom, your panic room, when a bison looked at you funny. Though let's be honest, no one was truly ever warm in a wagon during the winter. Not in the soul-deep, toes-unclenching hot water bottle sort of way. A good night simply meant you didn't wake up with your hair frozen to the canvas or discover that your socks had conspired to become a brittle artifact of frostbite prevention gone awry. To survive the night, people employed an entire catalogue of cozy improvisations. Hot rocks had been heated near the fire until they glowed like overly eager coals. Once, moderately cooled, or at least no longer capable of, igniting wool, they were tucked into bundles and nestled beside sleepy feet under quilts that had seen more winters than the family dog. These stones, despite their humble geology, became heroes in the dark hours between dusk and damp dawn. With the ingenuity typical of the frontier mind, leftover cornmeal mush might be repurposed into a midnight snack and a passive heating element, provided one didn't mind waking up with biscuit crumbs embedded in one's nightcap. And for the especially lucky, or perhaps just stubborn, tin stoves were affixed inside the wagons. Not always a safe choice, but safety was often outweighed by the need for fingers that could still bend come morning. The scent of burned wood, damp wool, and lingering lard, because someone had inevitably fried something greasy in the pan that doubled as a heat source, all mingled into what one might delicately call pioneer ambiance. It was a scent not easily replicated today, unless you took a tent, a campfire, a chunk of bacon, and a strong disregard for modern health codes and replicated history under duress. Sleep came in waves, interrupted by the creak pop of wood settling, or the occasional yowl of something curious prowling beyond the reach of the firelight. Coyotes were frequent nighttime visitors, though they mostly kept their thoughts to themselves. Occasionally, a mule would dream aloud, snorting or shifting its weight just enough to remind its human entourage that the livestock, too, wrestled with uneasy winter slumber. Children, depending on age and capacity for mischief, would often be strategically packed into bed like mischievous sardines, top to toe, beneath blankets stitched from flannel shirts that had outlived their wearable lives. Siblings became radiators, elbowed and fidgety as they were, but warm nonetheless. The wagon's small confines came with the rare benefit of group insulation, assuming everyone agreed not to breathe too audibly after bedtime, a rule mostly broken by Pa Richter, who was known to whistle through his nose like a faulty tea kettle while napping. And still, despite the discomforts, there was a certain charm to winter wagon nights, a sense of ritual, of resilient quiet, the kind of silence that made you listen deeper. Outside, the wind would moan, a sound both ancient and indifferent, and folks would pull the quilts tighter, press noses into flannel, and dream of warmth not yet arrived. Just outside, a thin layer of ice hugged the canvas, each crystal fractal catching bits of moonlight like 1,000 tiny lanterns. The prairie breathed under snow, inverted sky above, endless night stretched wide and patiently cold. And so they drifted, between dreams of spring rains, hearth fires, and the simple luxury of a bed that didn't require nightly negotiations with frost and flannel-coated siblings. From the stove's last ember came a soft crackle, like a punctuation mark to the night, signaling that the fire, like everyone else, was nearing sleep. It wouldn't be long before another dawn peeked over the white-capped ridges, bumbling with chill and possibility. But for now, under canvas and quilt, they slumbered, cold, dark, and still. And just beyond the frost-laced walls of the wagon, other things stirred. By the time January pressed its icy cheek against the canvas walls of a prairie wagon, it wasn't a matter of if you'd have frost on your mustache, but rather what size icicle it had achieved overnight. Winter on the trail had a certain personality, much like a stern aunt with cold hands, blunt, spirited, and absolutely indifferent to personal comfort. Fortunately, covered wagon pioneers were nothing if not enterprising, and sorely underdressed for the occasion. As night drifted in, the prairie transformed from a tundra of creaking shrubs to, well, colder. The wind slinked through seams with the grace of an insult at a dinner party, subtle, pointed, and able to ruin everything. Those realistic horror stories about waking up to find your hair frozen to the canvas lining. Entirely true. And while it was definitely a surprise the first time it happened, by the third or fourth, it was more of a mutual understanding between Pioneer and Frost. Still, folks made themselves cozy in absurdly clever ways. When nature neglects to install central heating, a person grows inventive. For starters, sleeping arrangements followed a pattern cultivated over miles of shared shivers. The youngest children were often tucked in between older siblings or parents, both a sweet family moment and a survival strategy, not unlike penguins in a blizzard. Women would often go to bed wrapped in multiple layers of wool, flannel, and what can only be described as emotional resolve. And yes, you might have worn the same long johns for a week or more, but dear listener, who among us in the 19th century was sniff-testing nightwear? No one, that's who. As the fire outside dwindled to embers, and it always did, no matter how much you begged it to stay, slumber became a group project. Every snore was communal. Every toss and turn echoed like a footnote in someone's diary. More than once, someone half dreaming and half frozen muttered, "Is it colder tonight? Or are my toes just hallucinating again?" Hot stones became an unreliable luxury. If you were lucky enough to have one, heated in the fire and tucked at the foot of your bedding, it gave you a few splendid minutes of warmth, followed by an hour of toe-concentrated disappointment. But even a cooling stone was better than nothing at all. In some wagons, potatoes were roasted, not for supper, but for use as little root vegetable heaters. Nature's disposable foot warmers. Interestingly, despite the hardship, many a diary describes these nights with near nostalgia. There was a strange, cozy intimacy to shivering beneath furs and patchwork quilts, sharing breath with the ones you trusted most. After all, hubris might get you out into the frontier, but only mutual endurance, and perhaps the tactical use of a shared dog, got you through a blizzard. Dogs, by the way, were not just companions. They were four-legged radiators. Curled up at the foot of the bedroll, a devoted mutt could provide just enough warmth to convince you that not all hope was lost. Small dogs were smuggled into blankets like contraband warmth, while larger dogs were often politely ignored when they claimed the entire pillow. Even socks had their own drama. A good pair, thick and woolen, could earn you lifelong loyalty or thinly veiled envy, depending on whether yours had holes. There are letters from the time period documenting the emotional aftermath of sock theft, which we must assume are the 1800s version of reality TV. And remember, all of this unfolded in a space no larger than a modest rowboat. one that creaked every time someone so much as sneezed. Privacy, an illusion. Modesty, negotiable. But among all the snoring, shifting, and occasional marital disagreement about who stole the blanket again, it somehow worked. Families stayed warm. Children dreamt peacefully of spring, and grown men might mutter poetry to the stars just to distract from the 17 fingers they couldn't feel. So as the frost quietly etched new patterns on the wagon's canvas and the horses snored louder than Grandpa, a strange kind of stillness fell over the prairie. Not silence exactly, but the hush of effort winding down for the night. Humans, animals, even the wind, all tucking themselves into the same frigid pocket of the world. And in that quiet, as the fire died to the softest orange coals, the imagination stoked up again. Tomorrow might bring ice across the river crossing or frozen beans for breakfast. But tonight, there were dreams of quilted warmth, salted pork, and maybe, just maybe, a new pair of socks. Let's drift a little deeper beneath the covers now, because somewhere out there on the blanket of white, a new kind of challenge is waiting at sunrise. As the wind howled against the canvas of the wagon, letting out the sort of banshee wails that could make a man reconsider all his life choices, especially the one that led him to Wyoming in January, a different kind of quiet settled within. It wasn't silence exactly. The fire outside might have been reduced to a sullen glow under a makeshift rock and dirt windbreak, but inside the wagon, the orchestra of winter rhythm played softly. The creaking of the wooden frame, the gentle clink of the ladle still swinging from a hook, the faint snore of a cousin tucked in a shared buffalo robe. All together, it was the lullaby of frontier survival. Add to that a tangle of wool socks, a canister of lard, and a deeply suspicious jar marked Grandma's clove salve, and you had all the ingredients for a good night's sleep. By 1847 standards. By now, wagon travelers had become experts in the sort of bedtime rituals one might describe as inventive, if not outright desperate. For instance, to preheat the family bed, yes, the communal rectangle of straw stuffed ticking shared by up to 5 people, they'd often stuff hot rocks beneath the blankets. These weren't just any rocks, mind you. No, they had to be smooth river stones, heated near the fire just long enough to radiate comfort, but not long enough to set off a series of tragic flannel-based events. The rocks were wrapped in flaps of old linen or the ever-multitasking grain sack, which by day held cornmeal, and by night became a sort of prairie hot water bottle, minus the water, bottle, and modern convenience. It was a bit of frontier roulette. Warm the toes, sure, but one unlucky nudge, and someone ended up spooning with a volcanic stone until breakfast. And while the hot rocks did a capable job of imitating actual warmth, prairie parents had an even more time-worn method for convincing little ones to sleep soundly through the chill. Storytelling. Not the twinkly, moral-rich fairy tales of Europe, mind you. These were frontier originals, tales of frostbitten cattle miraculously returning to life, of mysterious glowing light seen by the latrine, and of Old Man Jenkins, who survived an entire blizzard by sleeping beneath an ox. Now, the sleeping arrangements might inspire envy in no one, save perhaps a family of sardines. There was a hierarchy. Elderly folks were strategically wedged in the center, where collective body heat created the warmest slot, colloquially known as the engine room. Children, being more flammable and generically expendable in 1800s thinking, were assigned outer edges until someone noticed a tendency for them to wake up blue and crispy around the edges, leading to a rotation system that only slightly resembled a game of human pancake. And speaking of the children, smaller ones were often bundled inside what were cheerfully referred to as sleeping sacks, although to modern eyes, they looked alarmingly like canvas feed bags with drawstrings. These primitive sleeping bags were sometimes stuffed with straw for warmth, which offered at least the consolation of smelling like an enthusiastic horse stable rather than pure cold. Then there were the sounds. Sounds were everywhere, not loud or jarring, but ever present. Coyotes yipped poetically from a distant rise like unhinged lullaby singers. Horses shifted just outside the wagon, their huffs clouding the air like ectoplasm in moonlight. Occasionally, someone would let out a sneeze that echoed off the canvas with a might that could rouse a preacher. But the strangest sound of all was the wind threading its way through the wagon seams. Not a whistle, not a roar, but a kind of endless murmuring, as if the wind itself were telling secrets from one side of the prairie to the other, careful not to wake the sleepers huddled beneath quilts made of flour sacks and love. And dreams, oh the dreams! The cold did curious things to the unconscious mind. Elders reported dreams of cinnamon tea and large brick hearths. Children dreamed of swimming in hot molasses, sometimes waking up chewing their sleeves. Those brave enough to sleep facing east claimed to see mountains in their dreams, even if they had no memory of them during the day, perhaps a whisper of the land yet to come. Outside, stars stung the sky like crystal pinpricks. Inside, the air was a thick blend of breath, wool, and frontier determination. And so, despite the bites of cold and the groans of the timber beneath them, the wagon became a kind of moving cocoon, slowly drifting not through space, but through season and slumber. And as eyelids grew heavy and the ember light faded, the questions surfaced once again. Just how did they manage to stay asleep when mornings were even colder than the nights? A matter will settle soon, when the frost greets your nose before the coffee greets your cup, while the wind howled low over the prairie like an old dog dreaming of distant bones. The people inside the covered wagon lay nestled beneath layers of wool, flannel, and whatever else could be stitched, stacked, or borrowed into warmth. Winter nights on the American frontier were less of a season and more of an experience. One part survival, one part stubbornness, and just a pinch of stubborn survival. Now, you might imagine the crackling of a cozy fire, the scent of roasting chestnuts, perhaps a pipe gently puffed in the background. But alas, open flames inside a wooden wagon lined with grease-soaked canvas was considered more of a final act than a bedtime ritual. Fire, my dear listener, tended to have dramatic opinions about where it was or wasn't welcome. So instead, they used heated bricks, or sometimes baked potatoes tucked into socks, to bring warmth to chilled toes and fingers. Yes, that same humble spud from dinner could pull double duty as a bed warmer, practical and delicious, until someone tried to eat it mid-dream and woke up with potato sock lint on their tongue. Inside the wagon, a family would sleep in a human pile resembling a slightly irritable sandwich. Mum and Dad in the middle, with children tucked around them like mismatched spoons in a drawer. Blankets, quilts, and buffalo hides, should one be lucky enough to have scouted one, were tucked tight around the group, sometimes cinched with rope to hold in that precious body heat. The technique resembled burrito making, if burritos complained, squirmed, and occasionally kicked one another in their sleep. Despite the proximity and the padding, it was still cold. Not dramatic, poetic cold. This was nose-reddening, teeth-chattering. I think my breath just froze mid-air kind of cold. Ice sometimes formed on the inside of the canvas cover, creating a crunching sound when bumped, a sort of frosty applause for anyone rolling over too enthusiastically, and still, most slept deeply, tired from days of travel, chores, worry, and perhaps from trying to remember whose turn it was to fetch water from a stream that now existed mostly as a frosty rumour. The air in the wagon was still, heavy with the scent of wool, damp boots, and the quiet breathe-in, breathe-out rhythm of a family at rest. Outside, the moon cast a soft glow over the prairie, the frozen grass catching light in tiny silvery threads, nature's own nocturnal embroidery. Noise was minimal, save for the occasional creak of the wagon frame adjusting to the cold, or the haunting chorus of wolves in the far distance. Wolves were often more curious than cruel, but just to hedge their bets, many settlers hung bits of metal from the wagon, pans, ladles, tin cups, to act as makeshift alarm systems in case any four-legged guest decided to make unannounced visits. Nothing says, "go away," like the sudden clanging of breakfast instruments in the middle of the night. Interestingly, not every sleeper dreamt quietly beneath their wagon canvas. There were those with musical snores, nasal concerts in the key of fatigue, and the occasional sleep talker who muttered half phrases about pickled radishes and misplaced socks. But in such close quarters, this nighttime chatter often blended into the general aura of exhausted harmony. Some families kept a small dog for warmth, nestled into the blankets like a furry ember. These canine companions offered heat, companionship, and, should coyotes approach, a sudden ear-jarring burst of relevance. As with most nights on the trail, dreams were colored by equal parts hope and hardship. Would tomorrow bring clearer skies, a smoother trail, less snow, more socks? Even in their slumber, settlers held questions in their hearts, quietly stitched into dreams like patches on a weary quilt. Out here, with stars above and hard earth below, rest had to be negotiated with patience and ingenuity. There was little room for luxury, but just enough room for love, warmth, and the kind of comfort that rises not from plush pillows, but from people near you who would never leave you cold, even if they stole the better part of the blanket during the night. And so the prairie slept, and the wagon did too, gently rocking in place, sighing now and then as wood adapted to the hush of winter's hold. Up ahead, something stirred in the distance. Not danger, just the slow murmur of dawn beginning to think about making an appearance. But there is still time yet before the sky changes, before breath warms into steam, before the first reluctant boot hits the frozen ground. Let's stay nestled a while longer. There's a story I've been meaning to share with you, one about the strange and quietly heroic breakfast rituals that would define the dawns to come. While the westward wagon journey had no shortage of grand mythologies, buffalo stampedes, haunting prairie moons, and the ever vague but ever threatening Indians, one of the quieter, less romanticized episodes of frontier life, was the delicate art of rearranging your limbs without waking up everyone under the canvas. By the middle of the 1800s, most families traveling overland had acquired a particular set of winter sleeping skills, some learned by necessity, others by trial, and many from Aunt Hetty's grumpy murmurs the next morning about someone putting their feet in her face. Again, remember, inside one of those covered wagons, a single night could involve 5 or more people occupying a space smaller than a generous walk-in closet. And yet, somehow, they all managed to sleep, or at least lie there motionless, faking sleep so convincingly that nobody dared stir too quickly for fear of upsetting the delicate entente of elbows and kneecaps. Part of the secret lay in the orchestration of bedtime layers, First came the feather beds, hoarded lovingly even through the hellscape of river crossings and jagged terrain. Laid across wooden slats or atop barrels and crates, the beds softened a space that otherwise vocally resembled a chorus of aching spines. Then came patchwork quilts, many stitched over years, and scented faintly of both home and wood smoke. And then came the people. The favorite position of the pragmatic sleeper was known as the chimney stack, in which individuals lay shoulder to shoulder, alternating head to foot to minimize breath-on-breath contact and maximize quilt-to-body ratio. It was a surprisingly efficient method, until someone forgot which way they went to bed and ended up with a faceful of someone else's socks. A particularly sleepy man named Lewis Cartwright once declared that the only thing colder than waking in the wagon before dawn was waking up to discover your wife's bonnet had fallen off the tent pole and onto your face. In those tightly packed quarters, even a bonnet could function like a minor blizzard. To stay warm, some families deployed hot, water stones heated from the fire and wrapped in wool. Frontier hot water bottles, essentially, though you had to hope no one mistakenly left one smouldering with embers. The smell of scorched socks was said to linger well into spring. And oh, the snoring symphony. In the stillness of the prairie night, with canvas flapping like gentle wings overhead, the only warmth came from human bodies, and humans, as it turns out, are noisy heat sources. There were grumbles, mumbles, sleep sighs, and the occasional nocturnal dispute over space, in which sentences like, "That's my shin you're chewing on," were muttered without opening a single eye. Outside the wagon, wolves padded somewhere in the distance. The horses let out soft puffs, their breath like ghostly clouds in the freezing dark. The stars, oh the abundant stars, more than so many East Coasters had seen in a lifetime, sparkled like fragments of broken glass scattered lovingly across the black. But inside, the world narrowed to the creak of wooden wheels settling overnight, the slow exhale of a baby in slumber, and the scratchy rub of quilt over flannel sleeve. Some nights, the wind would pick up and mutter its way through the seams of the canvas cover, inspecting the button loops and frayed rope ties like a ghostly housekeeper. But truly cold nights, those sharpened to icy points, were perfectly still. Not a whisper of air, just the frozen hush that made even coyotes think twice about yipping. Morning, when it arrived, did so reluctantly. Light would sneak in through seams, announcing itself not with glory, but with a cautious diffusion, like a guest unsure it had the right address. No one moved at first. There was a hallowed, shared resistance to the first one who breathed deeply enough to sound like awakening. Because, as any sensible pioneer would tell you, the only thing warmer than the wagon bed in January was someone else's portion of it. And once a single soul rose, all warmth followed it out, into the frost. But, as all things do, the morning came. Boots were slipped into with grimace and prayer, a streak of icy water on the face, a muttered curse, and a quick check that nobody had frozen irretrievably in place. Everyone accounted for, limbs intact, tempers marginally thawed, and bacon already whispering over the fire. And so, the covered wagon stirred to life once more, wheeling into the next icy stretch, surrounded by the silence of snow and a horizon too wide to fill. Let's drift alongside them a little longer. Somewhere just west of the Missouri River, under a frostbitten crescent moon, a lone covered wagon sat quiet as a snow-covered turtle. Its canvas top sagged ever so slightly, the weight of a light snowfall pressing down like a cold, ghostly quilt. Inside, the Ludlow family was nestled in for what had become a nightly adventure across the prairie's frozen stage. Yes, the Ludlows were pioneers, but more specifically, they were unwilling participants in nightly reenactments of how not to freeze while sleeping in a rolled-up flour sack. Let's talk about the science, well, the frontier version of science, behind how people in covered wagons stayed warm, or attempted to, bless their denim-wrapped hearts. The wagon, a Conestoga, or a prairie schooner depending on how technically correct you want it to be, wasn't exactly insulated like your modern-day memory foam mattress or suspiciously warm electric blanket. It was a wooden box, on wheels, covered in canvas, built in essence to transport grain, or perish in. To combat the cold, families layered up, not in a trendy, turn-of-the-millennium kerchief and down jacket kind of way. No, think more like this. 3 wool shirts, 2 pairs of stockings, long drawers, which are what they charmingly called underpants back then, 3 wool blankets, a dog if available, and possibly a foot wrapped in the last remains of the flour sack, gloves, mittens. These were reserved for more extravagant pursuits, like surviving. But hands were usually tucked under armpits or between siblings sufficiently small and too sleepy to protest. The Ludlow children, Emma, Huck, and Tiny Pearl, were arranged like a family of potato halves, mashed together for warmth beneath itchy, questionably clean quilts that smelled faintly of salt pork and whatever candle wax hadn't fully burned away the scent of last week's boots. Now, heating a wagon was a creative venture. Fires were out of the question, unless one had a particularly flammable affinity for disaster. Instead, the Ludlows, like many others, used heated stones, the 1800s version of a hot water bottle, but sneakily harder to hug. By day, the stones would sit near a campfire, absorbing enough heat to make modest promises for the night ahead. Once tucked inside a cloth wrap or someone's discarded sock, they were dropped like treasure beneath the bedding. Warm lumps of geological companionship that usually cooled down, just in time for dawn's chill to tiptoe in. Of course, no discussion of wagon sleeping would be complete without mentioning the nighttime sounds. The occasional bleating of a goat, the wind practicing its banshee impersonation through the canvas flaps, the gentle snoring of a parent, the not-so-gentle snoring of an ox who had apparently decided to sleep upwind that night, but also moments of rare silvery quiet, the kind of hush that only a snow-covered prairie could master. A stillness so complete it made the crunch of a sock-shrouded foot feel like a percussion solo. Emma, the eldest at a worldly 12 years old, had developed a somewhat scientific bedtime ritual. She'd wrap her bonnet around her ears twice, pull her half-length quilt up to her nose, splay her wool mittened hands outward like a retriever playing dead, and announce, "If I do not wake, tell my story." Her brother Huck took this as permission to steal an extra corner of blanket, a transaction they had wordlessly agreed upon during a particularly cold evening in Nebraska. Their father, Jeremiah Ludlow, believed the best insulation came from reading bedtime Bible passages aloud until everyone fell asleep, partly from holiness, partly from boredom. Their mother, Abigail, often snuck her hands under her husband's sleeping pad shortly after lights out, which, in wagon terms, meant blowing out the single candle after some light wrestling with the wind, declaring that his body heat and sermonizing were the 2 things that would surely outlast winter. Nothing united a wagon family quite like the combined need to survive the night and ignore the occasional sound of a fox sniffing at the pantry box. That pantry box, by the way, lived like a prince beneath their bunk, inside hardtack, dried beans, a mostly empty molasses jug, and something formerly called bacon, but now formaldehyde adjacent. all of it frozen solid. Breakfast was less about flavor, more about thawing. And so, under the quilted patchwork of time and stars, the Ludlows and their frostbitten inventory slid gently into frontier slumber, facing due west, dreaming of hearths and hoping for a slightly warmer tomorrow. Because what lay ahead the next day was more than another cold sunrise. It was a journey's final stretch, and who knows, maybe even a bed with 4 legs and no wheels underneath. On the stillest nights of the frontier winter, when even the coyotes gave up howling and settled in for a long nap under the stars, the covered wagon hardly seemed like a vehicle at all. No longer creaking across prairie or bouncing rudely over frozen ruts, it became something else entirely, a winter cocoon, rocking only when the wind remembered it had somewhere to go. Inside, the occupants had long since found their places, folded in like spoons in a drawer, layered in flannel, burlap sacks, and the occasional scratchy wool army blanket that proudly boasted it once served in a totally different war. Breathing came slow. Boots, slightly too close to the foot-warmer stones, gave off the faint scent of warmed leather and dried mud from 6 dates ago. These settlers, hardy souls with the sleep schedules of dairy cows, had adapted to the rhythms of the natural world. A winter bedtime could come alarmingly early, sometimes before the sun had fully dipped its hat beneath the horizon. 6 p.m. Why not? Sleep now, dream of bacon and fence posts. Wake up at the hour when even owls are still rubbing sleep from their bird eyes. The fire, long since reduced to buried embers beneath the snow-packed fire pit, gave no light. But no matter, the night sky itself served as something of a traveling cathedral, with cold stars blinking like candlelight across a high wooden ceiling no human hand had ever nailed together. As the wagon settled into its night grunt, ropes tightening slightly with frost, canvas exhaling vapors from its seams, the sleeping family within encountered a different kind of quiet. Not silence exactly, but the sort of serene hush that only exists when not a single decision remains to be made. No telegrams, no mortgages, no rush hour traffic or shipping delays. Just the distant hoot of a long-suffering owl and the crisp sound of snow crystals shifting up the axle. Children, wrapped like tamales in quilts, stitched by grandmothers too stubborn to let winter win, drifted in and out of dreams crafted from memory and exaggeration. One dreamt of a cabin as big as a courthouse, with a chimney that smoked waffles. Another, more practical child, dreamt of soft hay and shoes that did not have mysterious holes appearing out of sheer spite. Parents, those weary dreamers with calloused hands and too many responsibilities, slept just as deeply, though perhaps more anxiously. Even in slumber, Ma might twitch at the imagined sound of a popping biscuit tin, while Pa's nose twitched every so often, likely performing some sort of pioneer echolocation to detect if their only pig had wandered off. And then there were the smaller details, forgotten by textbooks but archived in memory, that made the scene quietly, completely human. The one mug left over from 3 breakages, now pressed into duty as toothbrush holder, praying cup, and spider relocation device. The creak of the wooden floorboards on the wagon bed, which sounded suspiciously like the musical note C when stepped on in the middle of the night. The way the canvas top fluttered a bit at the ends when the wind hummed in just right, making the whole thing feel less like a wagon and more like a very chilly lullaby machine. Out across the frost-bitten landscape, other wagons speckled the terrain like discarded buttons, their own families tucked inside, dreaming similar dreams, warmed by similar stones, tucked under similarly hand-me-down quilts. The prairie in winter was not just cold, it was communal. Isolation bred a rare kind of closeness, and sometimes warmth showed up not from the fire, but from the steady forged comfort of enduring one more night together. And so, in the stillness, sleep moved gently from person to person, like a kindly ghost with good manners and a bedtime agenda. The wind outside may have argued with the canvas, but inside, dreams won every time. They told stories of summers remembered, of impossible harvests, of a barn that built itself because the neighbors were so kind and the weather so correct. Dreams when no one had to milk anything before sunrise unless they were into that kind of thing. Eventually, even the firestones gave up their ghost of warmth, sighing cool against bundled feet, and the sky turned a deep blue only found in painters' imaginations, prompting the stars to whisper goodnight in a language older than wagons. No voices now, only breath and snow. Time softened its steps, and another winter night, cold and dark and still, came to a close wrapped quietly in canvas and dreams.